Test, test. Test, test.
That we found today, I'm not sure about that one.
Test, test. Test, test. All right, guys, good afternoon. We'll get started with your review session. For your review, guys can continue posting questions onto the Schoology page throughout the entire review session. And then if you end up having questions that follow up and you are reminded of things after we get done with the review session, I'll be able to answer those questions via email if you have any sort of problems. For you guys, I was hoping to be in a good mood, but unfortunately, my fantasy football team is getting destroyed right now. I've never had a fantasy football week where I've picked up two guys and had them score a grand total of 0.9 points. I don't know if that is something that was able to show up, but I also played all the wrong people today, and so my team is getting worked really hard. Fortunately, though, the team that I'm playing against, from Mr. Daughter's team, would have beaten pretty much anybody in the entire league, no matter what I threw at him. But I'm getting the feeling that for my fantasy football team, I may be bad this year, which means that gives me more time to grade. Sadly, that also means disappointed, angry grading, and so I don't know how that'll work out, but I promise to keep my emotions in check when I'm grading your stuff. So hopefully you've had a great weekend. We'll be able to run through the questions. I'll run through periods 1, 2, and 4 in sequence, and then I'll double back and check to see if there's any questions after I get done, to see if there's any follow-ups. And if you guys do have any problems or concerns, like I said, let me know. So I'm going to be starting with questions from period 1. Dylan's got a question that asks, were there any specific persons or groups that helped with the funding of New Hampshire and New Jersey? I can guarantee for you on the test tomorrow that neither of those two are going to have a question related to them in that perspective. And so you do not have to have any sort of worries with them. On top of that, I don't really have a solid answer for you as where the funding streams came from, other than the fact that those two colonies are coming at the point where, after the first initial founding of Massachusetts, after Virginia, those are colonies that get started with friendships with the king, and eventually they become royal colonies, especially after that period of the Dominion of New England. So as long as you've got that under control, and you've got your major colonies taken care of, and so when I think about order of importance, Virginia and Massachusetts are your top most important colonies. Pennsylvania and New York, for the middle colonies, are going to be vital to understand. Understanding Rhode Island's attempt to create religious toleration, Maryland's attempt to create a Catholic haven, Carolinas with their Barbados codes, and then finally Georgia rounding out the colonies as a place for poor people to be able to establish initially anti-slavery, but eventually they become very into slavery. If you've got a handle on those are going to be much more important for you. Hamilton has a question, a couple questions. One of them says, besides the House of Burgesses, were there any colonies that were locally democratic? And what they want you to understand when you're reading your textbook is all of these colonies during the period of salutary neglect are going to have to set up an amount of local democratic control, because the king is not going to be directly telling the colonists how they do or do not need to live their lives. They're just expecting them to provide gold for home, for England, based on the system of mercantilism. And so as a result, for these colonies, you'll have the House of Burgesses in Virginia. You will have in Massachusetts Congregationalism, where each local town is largely governing itself. And then up and down the East Coast, you will find that they all start creating legislatures by the time of the 1700s. And they all have some degrees of democracy, some more than others, but all of them have embraced that as a way of governing themselves. Hamilton's other question is, what religion was the most dominant out of all the colonies? And that's really tricky because of the fact that depending on when that colony got started and when the waves of colonists started moving over, some colonies are established as a haven for religious freedom. Some of them are meant to be economic opportunities. So if we work our way from the beginning, Virginia was largely an Anglican colony. Maryland was initially started as a Catholic haven, but then it too became an Anglican tobacco growing colony, and the Catholics are going to be lesser and lesser in number. We'll find that there are, up in Massachusetts, a focus on Calvinism with the Puritans in Massachusetts, and the other colonies nearby are going to have different degrees of that religious faith that has problems with Anglicanism. So when we get to the American Revolution, we will find that For the colonists, their religious differences are somewhat of a problem, but we're also going to find that in Chapter 5, some of that stuff washes away. We'll find that the religious power of the 1600s is less influential in the 1700s. We'll find Rhode Island practices religious toleration. So does New York. Pennsylvania is a haven for Quakers, but it's got a bunch of other Protestants living in the back country. And then when you move to Barbados and Georgia, religion is not the key determinant of who's going there. So regardless of what people are announcing that they believe, it's not really the dominating factor. More people are trying to figure out ways to survive in a hostile area against the Spanish in the South, against Native Americans, against disease, and they're trying to make cash. So I see those questions as the questions for period 1. Aaliyah, I see your question coming in. How was Connecticut founded, and were there any specific founders? You have Thomas Hooker, who is going to be the head of Connecticut. The only thing that is really essential to know about with Connecticut is that they will create their Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is a constitution that is very similar to the Mayflower Compact. And so when you think about what's going up in Massachusetts, you have Pilgrims creating the Mayflower Compact. You have Massachusetts creating a city on a hill with congregational rule, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So you have these very religious people who are being very democratic with the ideas of having founding documents that will lay out the laws for how you can live inside that colony. Let me see here. Period 1, I do not see any more questions for you. But I'll double back at the end of the review session and see if you post anything before the review session's done. Period 2, Sophia has a couple questions. So first of all, can I explain feudalism? And so the way to picture feudalism is imagine back in the ancient times, in the Middle Ages, you had in Europe chunks of land that would be held by lords, and that lord would own the land. And they would own the gigantic fortification in the center of the land, whether it's a manor house or a castle that would have a church nearby or inside of it. And everybody who lived on that land was typically without title, which meant that they were not recognized by nobility, and they had no ownership of land. They were living on the land that belonged to the lord, and then at the end of the year, they would have to pay taxes, which was a portion of what they had made throughout the entire year to pay their rent. And so what we'll find is that for the people who are there, they really don't have any sort of ability to move someplace because the land's all spoken for. And they really can't challenge the Lord because the Lord could kick them out or throw them into jail. And the Lord is needed because if there are invaders that come in, they're going to be depending on the Lord for defense of that area. We'll find feudalism breaks down, though, because of the Black Plague that is going to kill millions of people in Europe, and it's going to destabilize that system where those people who have skills will start moving around the countryside looking for opportunities, and we'll find that feudalism starts to disintegrate and people will start gravitating towards the cities instead. When you think about feudalism, though, that idea of having a lord who controls land and all the people on it looks an awful lot like the encomienda system for the Spanish. And it looks an awful lot like the plantation system that you're going to see going on in the Chesapeake and further south. And you'll find that the patroons up in New York, who have a lot of land claims along the Hudson River, also look the same. So that's kind of the American dream during this time period for many people, is buy a gigantic chunk of land, then be able to bring a bunch of workers who will make that land profitable, and then hopefully become rich off of that, kind of like during the feudal times. Sophia's next question is, which colonies would you consider north, middle, and southern? So your break points are these. When you think about the northern colonies, Massachusetts is going to be the ones that you want to notice for New England. But the term, which ones would I consider north, middle, and south, is a little bit problematic, because what we'll find is in the middle colonies, those are also northern colonies, technically, when we get to the Civil War. So when we think about the northern colonies, middle and New England colonies would be northern. Georgia, Carolinas, and the Chesapeake, Maryland, and Virginia would be your southern colonies. Your middle colonies are Pennsylvania and New York, including New Jersey in there, but we're not super worried about them because that's not as influential as the others. So hopefully that gives you a breakdown that's good enough to be able to handle what's going on in the test. But from Pennsylvania north is the north, from Maryland south is going to be the South, in rough terms for this time period. Abby has a question. What was the significance of New Hampshire to the northern colonies, and who were the important leaders of New Hampshire? You'll notice that I de-emphasized that during our lecture and in class, because of the fact that for New Hampshire during this time period, it is very much following the lead of Massachusetts. It's kind of a spill area where once people fill up Massachusetts and those areas, they'll start drifting into that area. But as far as influence, they don't have much during this time period. And so you're okay just understanding that that area is developing. They will shove the Native Americans out of the way as expansion starts taking place. But beyond that, you're not really going to need to know a lot about New Hampshire. Let me see here. Roy, what religious groups founded, lived in different colonies, and why did they go there? Hopefully, I was able to answer a chunk of that when we were talking about which was the most dominant religions during this time period. When we think about why did they go there, for the people who are Anglican, they typically were coming for economic opportunities. So if you think about like the Virginia, Maryland, Carolinas, Georgia, those sorts of colonies, they're largely coming here not because they're being persecuted, but because they are able to work with the king to find an opportunity for land. When you think about other colonies, though, if you hear about a religious faith that isn't Anglican, those are the individuals who are typically fleeing, whether it's the attempted haven for Catholics in Maryland, which is going to bring over some Catholics, but not waves of them because they're not being horribly persecuted. That's going to be a group of people who are coming because they're discontent with England. Same thing with the Puritans and the Pilgrims up in Massachusetts and Plymouth. Same thing with the Quakers that you have in Pennsylvania. So when you hear about groups that are not Anglican, they're largely being drawn because of the fact that they want to have religious freedom. Julia, can I explain why New Jersey was founded and also Delaware? From Abby. For New Jersey, this is going to be an attempt by people who are friends with the king to establish a colony that can be a moneymaker. And they have a problem with squatters. And so people will move in, not pay their rents. There's really no police force to force them to do so. And so this attempt at a money-making colony doesn't do so great. And so it's just squatters who are there who are largely eking out a living, but they're not super important to the broader scheme of things, so much as New York and Pennsylvania. Delaware is going to be started as a farming colony, very much like what you have with Virginia and Maryland, but also not as consequential, so it's kind of following their leads. So for each of those two colonies, you don't need to devote a lot of time to understanding them compared to the other ones that I have emphasized previously. Aaron also had a question about New Jersey and why it was founded, so hopefully that takes care of you. Sophia has a question. What is the Mason-Dixon line? And so if you take a look at a map and you notice that Pennsylvania and Maryland have very jagged boundaries in some areas along the east and west coast, but when you take a look at the southern boundary of Pennsylvania and the northern boundary of Maryland, it's just a straight line. And the reason why is because the king was giving away charters to different individuals, and they weren't too worried about being specific and detailed with their charters until eventually Maryland grows, Pennsylvania grows, and they start butting up against each other, and it's hard to figure out where does Maryland stop and where does Pennsylvania begin. And so when you take a look at the straight line between them, that is a line drawn by two surveyors named Mason and Dixon. Those are their last names. And those two individuals determined where the official boundary line between those two states would be. That's also what's going to be the unofficial difference delineation between North and South. Now, eventually what will happen is you'll start off here with Pennsylvania and Maryland, and then eventually the South is going to follow rivers like the Ohio River out west. But for the beginning part of our history class, that term will suffice for the difference between North and South, and many people will still use that line to describe the difference between North and South, even though out west that line's not important since it's just from Maryland and Pennsylvania. Let me see here. Julia, if we don't need to know who founded New Jersey and New Hampshire, do we need to have them on our study guide, or are we learning about them later? I want you to have them done on your study guide, and so feel free to use Google if you need any sort of details beyond what's inside the textbook. All I'm using this review session to do, though, is to help get you prepared for the test tomorrow. And so for you guys, definitely do a Google search, look up the details as far as how they got started to see their differences. and then emphasize what their similarities are on the far right-hand side of your chart when it comes to economics and the influence of the environment on them. Let me refresh here to see if I've got anything else for period 2. I've got nothing else for period 2, but I'll double back to you guys to see if any questions are going to pop up later. So period 4, Amelia has a question. When the Chesapeake area is mentioned, which colonies are they a part of? Mainly Maryland and Virginia. Delaware will eventually be in there too. But for our purposes, when they say Chesapeake, mostly emphasize Virginia. And then understand Maryland is in there too, with their attempt to create a Catholic haven. But then eventually, when Maryland can't attract a lot of Catholics, they're going to eventually become very much like Virginia. And so there won't be much difference between the two of them. Madeline has a question. Do natives get along without any major complications with any area settlement besides the Pilgrims? No, not on a long-term basis. Although what you need to understand is you're doing a survey course. So if you were in college, they have different levels of classes, 100, 200, 300, 400 level. 100 is freshman year, 200 is sophomore, 300 is junior, 400 is senior. And the thing that you should realize is that in the 100 level class, they're just going to give you the basics. And so if you got into a 200 level class about Native American relationship to the colonies, you would find that for years, the Native Americans and colonists would be trading with one another, interacting with one another. But then what would happen is over time, diseases would happen. The colonies would grow. They would then encroach into Native American areas. Eventually, there'd be clashes over contested land, and then eventually, what you would find is Native Americans being pushed further back into the colonies themselves. But what we'll find is, like in Georgia, there are some Native American groups that are going to get pushed back, but you're going to have the Cherokee that remain there all the way up until the 1820s. When Andrew Jackson sends them away with the Trail of Tears. So up until that point, they're going to figure out a way to interact with the colonists for decades until eventually their removal takes place. So we're kind of shorting that with the idea that in the end of chapters 1 through 4, Native Americans have largely found themselves pushed towards the Appalachian Mountains. And they're engaging in the middle ground strategy where they're trying to work with whatever Europeans will work with them to try to eke out an existence. Let me see. Audrey, did the northern colonies that didn't have slaves still grow tobacco in addition to trading and forestry? Gotcha. So Audrey, no, they're not growing tons of tobacco up north, although tobacco can be grown in northern climates. It's not particularly suited for areas that are as chilly as our climate is, or up into New England. So typically what they're going to be doing is they're going to be looking for instead other crops that grow much more easily. So when we think about the middle colonies, they're growing grains. In the middle colonies, there are bread colonies that are feeding other colonies. Up in New England, they're going to have subsistence farming. So largely the farming that they're doing is not for export and trade. It's more to grow stuff in a garden style fashion where they're trying to grow enough food to provide for themselves and to provide feed for their animals. Let me see here. Finley, what was the difference between the Carolinas? South Carolina was started by kids who were affected by primogeniture in South Carolina. So the kids who were not the firstborn, but came from a rich family in the Carolinas, would then move to South Carolina from Barbados, bringing their ideas of slave plantations, and they built large rice or indigo plantations along the coastline. So you have the Carolinas here, you have Virginia up here. In between is North Carolina, and that area is going to be largely settled by squatters, so people who don't fit into Virginia. Let's say indentured servants who are not finding that they like it up against the Appalachian Mountains. They might move south to North Carolina so that they could settle there. Also people from South Carolina who aren't quite working out, people who are looking for land, and typically these are seen as the most low of the white people moving to the United States. Nicknames like hillbilly, cracker, redneck, poor white trash would be used to describe these individuals who are basically just trying to eke out a living in a pretty rough area, and they're just kind of scuffling along compared to what's going on with the big plantation owners in South Carolina, Virginia. And then eventually what will happen is South Carolina planters who are looking for more space will start moving to North Carolina, and shoving out those squatters. And that'll happen up through the next couple of chapters in your textbook. Audrey has another question. What are the most important turning point dates in chapters 1 through 4? The big ones have to do with the period concept outlines that you guys were looking at. So 1492, when Columbus arrives, is a big turning point to understand. 1607 with the creation of Jamestown, and 1630 with the Great Puritan Migration is a big deal as well. And then when you get towards the late 1600s, when you have like the Halfway Covenant, and you have Salem, and you have the Dominion of New England, where you see the king for a period of time get more involved in the colonies. They start losing some of their independence for a while. And then after the rise of William and Mary, the return of salutary neglect, where for the colonists, they're about to get another multiple decades where they're largely allowed to run themselves without a lot of English interference. That's going to create that independent streak that we recognize with the American Revolution. Let me see here. Finley, what role does Delaware play? Hopefully my explanation earlier for that did okay. If I didn't cover it enough, please post so I can help you out. Laura has a question. Did allying with the English at Plymouth actually end up helping the Wampanoag tribe for a bit of time? And so they were able to defeat their neighbors. But then eventually what's going to happen is as Plymouth takes off and as Massachusetts grows, those Native Americans are going to find themselves also pushed backwards away from the coastline. And so that's going to cause a huge problem and tension. And then eventually you have the Pequot War that breaks out and King Philip's War. And so we'll find with those two, that's going to eventually wipe out Native American influence along the colonies by the 1670s, 1680s. It's largely gone. Let me see here. Madeline, you said there was a point when America was more appealing because it was less regulated versus before it wasn't as appealing because of the death rate. When did that change? A year or a window between two important events? Not sure if this makes sense. Okay. I think I understand what's going on. So what I would say is those two things are not what I would see as being connected. So when we take a look at the Americas, there are many people like the Puritans who are excited to come to America because of the distance that they have between themselves and the king once they settle. They don't understand how germs work, though. And so when people start coming to the Americas, like when people up in New England start living decades longer than they do in the Chesapeake, they understand people are getting sick and dying down in the Chesapeake. They also understand they're not having that happen to themselves up in Massachusetts, but they don't understand the germ theory that's involved in that to explain why the two are happening. They feel blessed by God, and they're thankful that germs aren't coming to get them, but they don't understand that the people in the Chesapeake are living in a malaria zone where they're susceptible to yellow fever or malaria. And so as a result, you've got some confusion going on with that. When it comes to coming here because of less regulation, that's only applicable to some groups. Like if you're an indentured servant, the reason why they're coming is because of the fact that they are out of luck back in England and they're looking for an opportunity someplace else, and getting free transport away from England is better than what the alternative has been. And so when we think about these colonists, they're excited to come over here, or at least excited is the wrong word. They're willing to do so because they are looking for a chance. We will find, though, that for the people who live in an area for a while, they'll figure out how things work. And so especially the plantation owners in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, going in the Carolinas and South, they will recognize over a period of time that if you bring in a European to work on a plantation colony, they are most likely going to get sick. Half of them most likely are going to die. And then after Bacon's Rebellion, there's a solid chance they'll become rebellious because they hate the situation they're in after being indentured servants. So that's part of the reason why then slavery is introduced, bringing in slaves from areas that have experienced yellow fever and malaria, and they can be brought in with the idea that they're not going to get sick at the rates that Europeans will, and so that's where slavery is going to take off. So both of the things that you've got in your question are things that were considerations at the time. I just don't know that it was one then the other sort of relationship, especially in the minds of these individuals who don't understand the science of germs. Madeline, what did Lord Delaware do, and how important is he? He's the guy in 1610 who arrived from the Virginia Company in England and brought with him fresh settlers. And when he did that, the Jamestown colony was already on a boat, and they were excited to get on the boat and go back to England because things were going so badly here in the United States. And he found them precisely at the time that they were about to set off back to England, and he commanded that they go back onto the shore, and then he destroyed their ships. And so at that point in 1610, Jamestown could easily have just disappeared as people gave up on it and moved back to Europe because things here were such a mess. So Delaware is the one who kept Jamestown in existence and was able to impose more martial law. And then with the introduction of tobacco and that exploding as a money source, that then ensured that Jamestown would be able to survive into the future. Let me see here. Do you need to know specific Native American tribes, and if so, what are they? The Powhatan tribe near Jamestown is the most important of them to know, just understanding the interplay between how the Powhatan, the largest Native American group in that area, could have repulsed the Jamestown colony if they wanted to, but they saw an opportunity to trade. And they're a really good example to be able to use in your writing to show the interaction between English and Native Americans, where they traded for a period of time, but then Europeans encroached into the Native American territory, causing all sorts of tensions, and then it led to two large Anglo-Powhatan wars that you'll want to be able to describe in your writing on your multiple choice test. The other Native American groups that are described specifically are described through their wars, like the Pequot War that you have up in Massachusetts. And then Metacom would be somebody you'd want to describe with King Philip's War, who built an alliance to fight back against the Massachusetts colonies. And eventually that alliance disintegrated and led to the pushing out of all of those Native American groups. That looks like the last of the questions that I've got for period 4. Let me refresh and see if I've got anybody else. I've got 2 other questions that just popped up. Finley's got a question. Can you explain what happened when Massachusetts got the charter taken away? Gotcha. So this is a question about the Dominion of New England. What essentially happened is Massachusetts temporarily lost a lot of their freedoms, or at least were in danger of doing so. Edmund Andros was made the governor of the entire colonies from New York north. He had the power technically to take away freedoms and rights, but he really didn't have the military to be able to do so. But he was threatening those sorts of things. And so without their charter, the people of the New England colonies felt kind of shaky about how free they actually were. And in Massachusetts' case, how much of a city on a hill they actually were. Now, in the case of the Dominion of New England, it was only around for 2 years. And then there was a rebellion back in England. William and Mary were made the king and queen. They were brought in from the mainland. They were not British. But Protestants in Britain wanted these royal Protestants who had married one another from 2 powerful European families to then move into England and become the king and queen to replace the Catholic king that had ascended to the throne. And with that, when William and Mary became the leaders there, they recognized the Dominion of New England was making all of these fellow Protestants over in America really unhappy. And so they got rid of Edmund Andros, they got rid of the Dominion of New England, but instead of returning to the idea of a city on a hill, they just returned each of the colonies from New York North to being royal colonies. So from this point forward, John Winthrop's vision of a city on a hill is not really what's guiding that colony so much anymore, because John Winthrop is dead, that whole generation is dying off, they're going through their halfway covenant to try to keep their faith alive. But for that colony, they do like the return of salutary neglect and being able to govern themselves. Let me refresh again to see if period 4 has any other questions for me. I see none right now, but I'll buzz back through and check to see if I've missed anything else. So this is my final pass for any sort of questions. If you've got anything else that needs to be dealt with before your test tomorrow, please make sure you post. Let me see here. I've got in period 1, let me see here. A few more questions have popped up. Maylee's got a question. Can I explain salutary neglect in King Philip's War more? Salutary neglect is just the fact that the king is describing the colonies as being his possession under his control. In reality, though, the king is very loosely governing the colonies, giving them tons of independence, neglecting them with his governance, and all he wants to do is to have mercantilism work. And so if they just keep sending back wealth to the king, then everything's going to be fine. For King Philip's War, that was Metacom up in Massachusetts, who built an alliance with all of the Native American groups that were near Massachusetts. They then fought back against westward expansion for a period of time until the alliance fell apart. And the colonies in Massachusetts were able to then push the Native Americans out of the way so that they stopped resisting westward expansion. Jackson has a question. Was there a majority religion in Rhode Island? I'm not certain about that. What I do know, though, is Rhode Island made it explicit that they did not have an official state religion. And so whatever religion you practiced, you were safe and fine. So in that case, even if there was a majority of people who were a certain faith, my bet would be that they'd be Puritans. They're going to be working with the understanding that everybody gets along with everybody else. And as long as you're Christian, everything is going to be fine. Let me see here. Alexa has a question. Do we need to know the specific dates that the colonies were founded? A couple of them are big. Massachusetts in 1630 with the Great Puritan Migration and 1607 for Jamestown. Those are the two that are the really big ones that you need to understand. And then the other colonies are being founded after that period of time. But understand that those are the beginnings of the colonies is the best place to be. Hamilton's got a question for the test. Will it mainly focus on relationships between New Englanders, New Englanders, Native Americans, New Englanders, New Englanders, the three main big groups we talked about in class and how they relate to one another? No. So the test that you're going to be doing tomorrow is a multiple choice test assessing your ability to read and retain content from chapters 1 through 4. So there'll be a section of questions on chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and they're content questions. It's checking to see when you read, did you actually understand the specific facts that you were reading about? So if you remember the skills sheet that I gave you in class, this is the first column of can you understand and remember specific key concepts? And then also skill number 5 gets into relationships a bit, but this is more about can you understand what the specific details are so that when I start building on top of that, I can start doing things like your multiple choice tests you've been doing from AP Central, where you read a passage and then you can make connections, and can you write about it too? So this is just the basics of getting your facts down so we can then go ahead and use them to perform other skills. Let me refresh one more time with period 1, and then we'll be done with period 1. I see no more questions there, so period 2. Sophia has a question. Would the wretched bachelors be considered squatters? Yes. So what you have there is you've got these poor indentured servants, and in the Virginia and Maryland headright system, when a planter got 50 acres of land to add to their plantation, imagine that they're settling along a river and they've got this plantation here and they get to add another 50 acres onto this land that's got frontage on the river. When an indentured servant gets done with their indentured servitude, they're supposed to get that 50 acres. What's going to happen, though, is that the planters here are not going to give them this prime location right here. They don't want that free indentured servant anywhere near their plantation. They're going to give them land that's deep in Virginia, near the Appalachian Mountains and far away from the rivers, to get them away from the plantation that they're trying to operate. Now, for these poor individuals, they also have very little chance of finding somebody to marry because of the fact that intermarriage with the Native Americans is not condoned, and the Native Americans aren't super excited about the British anyways. And if women do travel across the ocean, it's a choice between some poor indentured servant or somebody who's on the plantation who either owns it or is the son of a plantation owner. The choice is pretty obvious. And so you've got these indentured servant guys who are trying to figure out a way to just eke out existence, get some land to grow some food on. They have dreams of becoming wealthy and maybe owning other people themselves, but most likely they're not going to be able to achieve that. So they're going to be struggling throughout their time there. Aaron's got a question. Were there other diseases other than malaria and yellow fever that the colonists got? They got tons of diseases. Those are just the two that they're now encountering, because what's happening is people are coming from England, which is a northern climate, And what we didn't have is we didn't have malaria or yellow fever make the jump from the old world to the new world until Europeans started transporting stuff. So when they start operating this triangular trade, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese, they will go through Africa picking up mosquitoes that will then have these tropical diseases that they will then bring over to the Americas. And so while coming from America to Europe, the only major disease was syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease. The Americans are bringing over malaria, yellow fever, especially in tropical areas, but then they're also bringing over things like smallpox and other sorts of terrible diseases that are not mosquito driven. So some of these diseases are new to Europeans, and they're going through that. And then some of the diseases are just new to Native Americans, and they're getting clobbered by all of these diseases in combination. Let me refresh period 2 to see if I've got any other questions that have popped up here. Sophia's got a question asking about the multiple choice test. If the whole test tomorrow is multiple choice, yes. So tomorrow's multiple choice test is going to be 50 multiple choice questions, and they're not the multiple choice questions that you've been seeing from AP Classroom. Those are what the AP test in the spring looks like. These are just content driven. Can you read a question? And then from the multiple choice options, can you come up with the right answer? And once we start getting better with those questions, we'll then be able to use that skill of having your content down to be able to do primary and secondary source reading and essay writing. So this is skills wise not as difficult as the reading quizzes that you have with like reading a passage and coming up with answers. They are nitpicky, so that's the reason why the curve is going to be set to 44, because you will find that it's asking for a reading level that maybe you might not have been doing in the past. And we'll see how well you did with that when you take your test tomorrow. Let me hit refresh one more time for period 2 and see if I've got anything else. I do not see any more questions for period 2, so let me move on to period 4. Zoe's got a question. What was the environment in the middle colonies like? This would be like Pennsylvania, New York. And so when you think about those areas during the wintertime, like you've ever seen the ball drop on New Year's in New York, their winters are cold, but they're not as cold as what we have here in Minnesota since we're landlocked. They're right up against the Atlantic Ocean. And you'll find that the Atlantic Ocean helps to moderate the temperatures, especially on the coastline. So in Pennsylvania, in New York City, in New York State, they can get big snowfalls, they can get cold winters, so they're not a plantation style hot sort of zone. And you'll find that from about New York north, where we have that Pennsylvania north, where we have the Mason-Dixon line, that's largely accidentally where that malaria zone boundary is going to be. Where north of that line, it's really hard to get mosquitoes that are developing in a way that can spread those diseases up into those northern areas, because the winters are harsh enough to kill off those bugs. So in that environment, it's kind of like Minnesota, a little bit more mild, and that's the reason why they're called the bread colonies, because they can grow a lot of food, kind of like we do in the state of Minnesota. Let me see. Laura, did the Spanish Armada ever recover from being beaten by the British? They did not. And so the problem that they had run into is around the time the Spanish Armada was defeated, they were also experiencing piracy, where the British sea dogs were going out and capturing the gold that was going to Spain. And more Spain started focusing on the idea that it needed to protect itself on the European continent, especially since the Pope was encouraging them to think about fighting wars for Catholic faith in order to try to take on Protestants that were developing in Northern Europe and up in England. And so we'll find that their armada never regains the prominence that it had before. And once those English colonies get started, and also colonies that the British start in the West Indies, the Spanish will still try to maintain their colonial control, and they'll be able to do so until the 1800s. But they aren't the same fearsome sort of group that they had, because England is going to start ascending quite quickly. Let me hit refresh for period 4 one more time. Let me see here. Martin, I see period 1 multiple choice test on AP Classroom. Are we taking the assessment there or on Schoology? Good question. You're going to be taking the assessment on Schoology tomorrow. And so when you come to class, bring a charged Chromebook. What you're seeing on AP Classroom is a progress check. And so once we get done doing your multiple choice test, I'll be giving you that progress check this week to give you some feedback about, if the AP test was today, how would you be doing with material from period 1 on the multiple choice portion of the test? And then we'll be able to discuss and work through that. But again, with the idea that we're months away from the AP test. So all of this is just about getting your feet wet, kind of getting you acclimated to the difficulty of the class, and then sorting out what we need to do with your study strategies to make sure that you're safe and good. Madeline, did Roanoke Island ever get repopulated? Not as a British colony. And so you're gonna if you ever travel to the coast of the United States, you will find that we've got a bunch of these sand islands that are off the coast of the United States that aren't really all that documented or recognizable. And that's what Roanoke was. It was really not the best place to be populating people, especially if you notice what happened with the hurricanes that just blasted the Bahamas. If you're out there on a spit island, and the water levels rise at all, you're in deep trouble. And so what they realized is being inland would be better. But then Jamestown's problem was if they settled too far inland, they would be on top of the Powhatan Native American group. And so you're going to find there's all sorts of problems there. But for Roanoke, no, not in a substantial way that's important for our class. So let me check to see if I've got any other last minute questions. Thank you for all the questions tonight. And my hope is that this has been helpful for you guys. I do not see any more questions for period 1, period 2, and period 4. So it looks like we're finished. But like I mentioned to you guys, if you have any sort of questions or problems, once this stream wraps up, I'll be checking email tonight until about 10 o'clock this evening. My fantasy football team is not getting any better right now, so I'm just going to click close on that as well, and relax for the rest of the evening. So I'll be looking forward to any email questions you guys have. Remember, when you come to class tomorrow, bring a charged Chromebook with you. This is an online test that you'll be taking. You'll drop off your notebooks up in the front of the room unless you've got notes you've taken online. And then I'll have a place for you to be able to submit those tomorrow when you come to class. And then you should be able to see your scores shortly after you get done with your test. And then we'll just review through your test on Tuesday so you can kind of get a look at what went right, what went wrong. But again, remember, you get to throw out one test per quarter. You also are going to have a curve of 44 out of 50. If you've been doing all of your work up until this point, you've been making your grade safe with a buffer already. And then on Friday this week, you've got your 20-question physical geography test that is just straight up memorization. And that also can serve as a really nice buffer as you're getting your feet underneath you. So hopefully everything's going well for you. Hopefully this worked well for you tonight. And if you have any other questions or problems, please email. Good luck this evening. Thanks.